Hello, Murtaza. Hi.
Hi, Nico.
Hi. So today, along with film critic Murtaza Ali Khan, whom I thank to be here with me, we will remember one of the greatest film directors in the history of cinema, as well as one of the most influential artists, we could say, of the 20th century, Federico Fellini. We will look through Fellini filmic works in the occasion of the centenary of his birth. Let's give a quick introduction to Fellini's early life and the beginnings of his career. Although Fellini spent most of his life in Rome, he was born in 1920 in a middle-class family in Rimini, a small town located in the Adriatic Sea coast and best known as a summer destination for wealthy foreign tourists. As a kid, Fellini was fascinated by the circus as well as other forms of local entertainment and popular theater. I think, for example, of variety shows, which consisted of a combination of music performances, slapstick comedy, and magic. Another great influence for the young Fellini was, of course, cinema, and he himself cited the films of Charlie Chaplin, the Marx Brothers, Laurel and Hardy, as highly influential for his future work. In addition, Fellini looked at the great tradition of American cartoons as an inspiration and used to spend hours and hours drawing sketches and inventing his eccentric characters. A few years later, in 1939, Fellini moved to Rome along with his mother and sister. To me, this shift from the small-scale provincial life of Rimini to that of the capital city of Italy, it's quite relevant. And it somehow resonates with the condition of Italy, which from being a mainly agricultural economy was becoming a more and more industrialized and urbanized country. In Rome, Fellini enrolled at the Faculty of Law, but he could never complete his studies. He instead began a career in journalism, working as an illustrator for various magazines and newspapers. And while working as a journalist in Rome, Fellini made the acquaintance of people such as Cesare Zavattini, one of the foundational figures of Italian neorealism, and also actor and comedian Aldo Fabrizi, who will introduce him to his future mentor, the great film director Roberto Rossellini. How would you comment, Murtaza, upon Fellini's first steps in the film industry?
For me, this phase of Fellini, it's very difficult to, separate it from the time that Italy was going through. We are talking about a very interesting phase. In fact, not just Italy, the whole of Europe was going through a very interesting turnaround. The economic crisis was slowly, paving way to a new sort of a political movement. And I can only imagine that a young Fellini, his mind would have been full of ideas, and coming from a rural place to an urban one, the kind of tumultuous conflict that he would have gone through as an artist at that point in time. And probably I feel somewhere the artist in him, as he would have interviewed more and more people, somewhere at one level or the other, he would have realized that cinema is slowly shaping up into this new art form, and which actually is like an accumulation of all the existing art forms. So probably that would have appealed, Fellini greatly, I feel, and probably that's what would have, taken him slowly in that direction, which started off, as a screenwriter with, writing those films for Rossellini, and leading to, him himself taking up filmmaking in a big way. How can we forget his contribution to a film like Rome Open City, for which he also got Oscar nomination as a screenwriter. And then, it paved the way for Pesa, which was his second Oscar nomination. And I think, and one thing that I wanted to touch about, Aldo Fabrizi, is that Rossellini, when he, first met Fellini, he knew about his interview and his interactions with Aldo Fabrizi, all those years ago. And so Rossellini actually requested Fellini to help him cast him for that role of the priest in Rome Open City. So you see how the circle comes, full. All those interesting people that Fellini met in the 30s, eventually they had a stronger influence and probably paved the way for him becoming a bigger artist, so to say, not just someone who was associated with just one art form, but someone who was transcending these art forms and becoming into a more consummate sort of an artist.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think? How do you look at this?
Absolutely, and I appreciate that you reference to the work on Fellini on the Rome Open City, and how he was. This is quite certain how he was involved in the character building for the figure of the priest. Which will end up being probably the most iconic character of the movie. So it's quite important. I mean, for a director like Fellini, who has gained, worldwide recognition with his very personal cinema, but he sometimes overlooked, for his role in Italian neorealism, which is often associated, just to the names of Rossellini, De Sica, Visconti, but actually it was an important player, in the making of these films.
Absolutely.
It's quite interesting the way in which he shifts from being a screenwriter to being a director. I mean, this transitional phase is also a very overlooked phase of his career, right? So everyone has seen Variety Lights, but that keen interest that Fellini manifested about media culture, we mentioned he was working as a journalist in a newspaper. He was, of course, an illustrator. Before becoming a film director, he worked on radio shows. Sometimes
that's where he met Giulietta for the first time, his
exactly.
to-be wife.
Exactly. And radio at the time was probably the real mass media in Italy, and there was a phenomenon of media convergence with other forms, the popular theater forms that were finding spot on the radio frequencies. So it's quite interesting how Fellini deal with other entertainment forms in his first two films, for example, if we consider also Variety Lights and The White Shake, of course, So how he deals with this form of theater that in Italian is called varietà, or even avant spettacolo, as well as soap opera, photo strips. There is like a keen interest that Fellini had in entertainment and stardom.
Nico, somewhere do you feel that this early phase of Fellini's career, somewhere this laid the foundation for what was to follow? Because this is something that, has always fascinated me. The sudden shift from neorealism to, the Fellini-esque. Do you somewhere feel that these early days of Fellini, wherein he was, experimenting with these new forms, theater, and he was also, very closely involved with, radio. Do you feel that somewhere these things had a strong impression on his evolution gradually as a filmmaker through the 60s and, to the 70s and so on?
I can only answer as a cinephile, since I've not really researched upon this topic. But just something that come to my mind, is how, for example, a person like Orson Welles, also started up his career, with radio and theater. And then, it became something else. It became, probably the first author, of world cinema.
Yes, with Citizen Kane. Yes.
So, I don't know. But I see like a constant, consistent interest in media history. Making Fellini almost a sort of media archaeologist, of his times. And that's something that is quite overlooked, because Fellini normally, you know, the Fellinesque is mostly associated, you know, to the circus, which is, by the way, another form of entertainment. But, you know, Fellini is always associated with this dreamlike
Clowns,
imagery,
yes, dreams.
clowns. So putting him as a media archaeologist, like somebody that has always been attracted by forms of expressions over several medias, I think that that could be another way to read this work.
Indeed.
And let's talk about his transition from the neorealist phase, let's say, to his more, you know, personal cinema. This somehow, we are referring, of course, to the decade of the 50s, you know, being, you know, the late 40s and the early 50s, the neorealist period, and the 60s onward is really art cinema phase, where he was somehow in dialogue with other directors that that create, you know, a modernist cinema all over the world. You know, the 50s again are a transitional period, and I think this liminal state of his cinema is very interesting to discuss.
Mhm.
What do you think?
Absolutely. I think 70s was a very important phase, for the world cinema. If I talk of Italian cinema, there were names like Fellini, emerging. There was Antonioni. If I talk about, Japan, there was Kurosawa, coming off the ranks. And if I talk of Ingmar Bergman, there was Kurosawa. Uzo was also being slowly rediscovered. So I think 50 is a very important phase. And if I just focus on Fellini, for me, it is, the decade wherein we got films like La Strada. And La Strada, is such a big film for not just Fellini. For me, it has been a film which has allowed me to understand Fellini better. As a teenager, the first film that I, got my hands on was Eight and a Half. But probably I was a little too young, a little too early for me to explore a complex film like Eight and a Half. And that's when I decided to go back a little further. And that's when I finally decided that let's start with La Strada. And La Strada, allowed me to access Fellini in a very, very different and a very, very simplistic way. For me, the film is nothing but, an interesting retelling of the classic tale of Beauty and the Beast. Somewhere I feel this idea of Zampano being the brute, and this beautiful girl played by Giulietta Messina, this sense of innocence that is associated with that characters of her. And if you see the complex relationships, I think I can't help but comment Fellini at how he was able to bring this classical idea of the fact that everybody is capable of being loved and everybody is capable of love. Sometimes we can tend to have this imagination that the wretched people probably are devoid of love, but watching La Strada, I get this sense of realization every time that every human being or everyone, I think, is capable of love, as we gradually saw through the character of Zampano, beautifully played by Anthony Quinn. And for Fellini, I think he was able to bring in those elements of circus with the clown. So again, as we would gradually see more and more, surrealistic images entering his film, I think La Strada is a great way to enter his body of work. If you are uninitiated or if you haven't seen much of Fellini, that is somewhere you can get started.
Absolutely, and it's also a great film to witness the transition now between his neorealistic phase to his more personal cinema. No? For as far as I'm concerned, in the 50s, the movie that I somehow personally admire more from Fellini, or which I consider very important, is I Vitelloni. No?
Absolutely, yeah.
So 1953.
I think one of his most influential films.
So the depiction of the small town life is very important in this film, and it's something that will come back again along across his career. I think of Amarcord, but I more than anything I admire I Vitelloni a lot because it's somehow an antecedent for a lot of independent cinema that will come much later, up
I
in
personally cannot
film
imagine a
history.
film like Mean Streets. Yes, Scorsese's Mean
Exactly.
Streets. Even George Lucas, so many films. I think it's like an
American Graffiti, for
American
example.
Graffiti. It's
But we
unimaginable.
could
Yeah,
go on. We could go on till the 90s or even
the
the
influence is endless.
exactly. So, if I think about the genealogy of, independent cinema, I think of Orson Welles, and then I think of Vitelloni. These are
Wow.
somehow the authors and the film that, somehow have given that notion of authorship, independent authorship, that will be so important from the new Hollywood times onwards.
Indeed.
Now, I think, 1960, 1960 is extremely
The decade, yes, the decade that changed
important
it all,
year.
yeah.
In what you think Fellini has become a different artist in the 60s?
First and foremost, I see a very personal Fellini emerging out, from the constraints of neorealism. Now we see an artist who is free to exercise himself, to express his creative potential out there to the world. And these images are very, very personal. During the 50s, Fellini went through a very difficult phase of depression. And during that therapy that he was taking to counter depression, he ended up making friends with a psychoanalyst who introduced him to Carl Jung. And through his association and introduction to works of Carl Jung, Fellini discovered this new side, this new horizon, which really opened up this oniric side of Fellini's work with these dreams, these surrealistic images, which can be called grotesque, it can be called bizarre. This amazing amalgamation of the sacred and the profane, the earthy and the sophisticated, which came to be known as Fellini-esque with time. So this is, I think, very inherent in how Fellini, went about making films in the 60s, starting with La Dolce Vita, slowly and gradually moving on towards his more personal works like Eight and a Half. If I just speak of La Dolce Vita, for me, that opening scene means so much. I told you the idea of the sacred and the profane. It's so much, ingrained in that opening scene, wherein you see this statue of Jesus Christ being flown by a helicopter over the Vatican, and you have these girls in bikini, looking at this from far distance, waving at each other, and trying to establish a communication which otherwise may seem a little difficult in real life. But when he is able to do that, that scene is so powerful when Marcello in that helicopter, comes back and he starts having this conversation with these bunch of girls on the rooftop. And at the same time, we are talking about the statue of Christ. And these two ideas, how he was able to bring it together so seamlessly, bringing those two different ideas, and eventually a film which was much more than this opening scene. So that very scene itself tells us that we are in a very different territory. We can expect something very different. This is no longer the Fellini which we saw in La Strada or I Vitelloni or Nights of Cabiria. This is something different. And I think the whole world was taken by surprise from that very moment of that statue being flown over the Vatican.
And actually, La Dolce Vita, even if it's not probably my favorite of Fellini's movies, is a source of iconic images that
part of the popular
so
culture.
Since we are discussing this, we cannot mention the film that was released a year after La Dolce Vita, which is 8.5, Otto e Mezzo, which is considered the greatest movie about filmmaking. For example, a scene that personally resonates with with my idea of Fellini is the dream in which he is dealing with all the women of his life, past, present, and future. I don't know who else could have imagined a scene like that.
I, for one, can't imagine David Lynch, making films without the influence of Eight and a Half. So much of films that we see now more and more with this visual artistry coming out, wherein images take the forefront and dialogue take the back seat. I feel all these films somewhere at one level or the other owe something or the other to Eight and a Half and to other films of Fellini which followed, like Juliet of the Spirits and Cetricon. I think Fellini is now with Eight and a Half taking a very different tangent, to what he was doing in the 50s, and even with La Dolce Vita, those new realistic, threads were still there. But I think with Eight and a Half, he's slowly drifting in a very different direction.
Absolutely. And it's probably the best film to refer to is dreamlike, oniric, quality, the dreamlike quality of the cinema, no? Being, somehow a chain of dreams that are also films on their own, And
the opening scene, so to say, it's like a film in itself, as you rightly said, of him, trying to escape this car, and he, exits this car from the rooftop, and he, flies in the air, and he's being, connected to a rope. And this is so bizarre in a way, and so fascinating, and how he's able to, take us through. The film is obviously, as you said, it's like a sequence of many dreams, probably dream within a dream associated to another dream, and we don't even know, where we start and where we end. And I think that's the beauty of the film.
And then, we come to a movie that to me mark the end of this golden age of Fellini, which is Amarcord. But I find it very useful to introduce another aspect of Fellini's mode of filmmaking, which is related to his way of directing actors. And as a collage, of different characters, Amarcord reveals, in a sense, it reveals Fellini origins as comic artist. So with this very, detailed characterization of, the individuals that people his films. And strangely enough, Fellini's characters are compelling from the beginning, You can have them on screen for 5 minutes, but you already know a lot about them. Something that
even without any backstories.
Exactly.
I think a lot of the younger filmmakers can learn from it.
Something that we can set against, the work of a lot of other filmmakers who work who develop the character in a more naturalistic way,
That's so true. And I think he would enact, every time, he would tell his actors that this is how it is supposed to be done. And often he would shout on his sets. And probably that is also one of the reasons why he would ask his actors just to focus on the facial emotions. For him, the facial emotions meant everything, because he knew that he can get the audio right, the dialogues right in the post. He can dub them. But these emotions, and I think these emotions and what these faces speak and tell you is the reason why these characters don't feel alienated. Right from the very first moment, you are able to relate to these characters. And I think only Fellini and a very few, very, very selective few filmmakers can, claim to have done this, wherein a character comes to you and you have an immediate connect with that character right away.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there are two aspects that I think we didn't discuss yet. One is, the incredible craftsmanship that was behind the construction of the film set. On the one hand, Fellini was hiring non-professional actors, somehow learning from the lesson of neorealist from his neorealist course. On the other hand, he was using the studios. He would not. He would not. Of course, he was not resorting to location shooting as much as, a Rossellini or an Antonioni would have done, so that's a distinctive trait of his cinema, no? And another one is the music, of course, because we cannot think of Fellini
Nino
cinema
Rota,
without
yeah.
Nino Rota's scores,
Absolutely.
So after Amarcord, a new phase slowly fade in for Fellini, and we have also to frame it in media history. This last phase, it was the time when many thinkers were claiming that cinema was dead, because of the advent of television, and this dialectics between cinema and television find in Fellini's film a very interesting, declination. What do you think?
I also feel, Fellini at first, was a bit resentful about television, in his interviews, particularly with the interview with Madhu Jain that I was talking about in 1983. He was, a little bit critical of television, and he felt that television, is home to excesses, wherein as an artist, he wanted to try new things, but somewhere he felt that television hindered that. But with his film, Ginger and Bread, I think he played a very important role in establishing a direct dialogue with television. Always look at this film as this interplay between television and cinema, because ultimately the film is about these two dancers, who haven't been in practice for the last 30 years, and they come back for one more performance for the television reality show. So in a way, Fellini is now having a direct dialogue with television. Something, that he always felt, was missing is now something that he is exploring. So again, as part of media studies, as part of someone who was taking keen interest in what was happening around him, not just as an artist, but also, as someone who shares a very intimate role with media and how it was slowly making way to new and new forms. I think 80s was a very important phase for television, and cinema was always, having this, back and forth love-hate relationship.
This last phase also, being, situated in a moment where new medias were emerging and, communication was speeding up. And of course, as you mentioned, Fellini was critical, as many other directors, of the role of television and the fact that films were interrupted by commercials 2 3 times at least, but somehow Fellini, was fascinated by
Instead
this
of resenting,
change in
he
the
actually
media landscape.
he
Yeah.
embraced it in a big way. I think that's what, elevates, his stature as an artist, that he was still able to, adapt to the times, and he was able to speak, you know to the world at large, that, this is what I think of this, and this is what, gonna be like for me going forth. Because a lot of these artists, and that's why probably why he was still relevant for those 5 decades. A lot of the artists, they go through phases, and, then they tend to become irrelevant once the decades pass by. But Fellini was relevant, even towards the later part of his career, even the fag end of his career, he was still, quite relevant. And from what I heard, that he was working on Scorsese on a film, and that was to be, produced by an American studio before, that tragic thing happened. Obviously, this was after he had won the honorary Oscar in 1993, and he was planning to work on this new venture with Scorsese, and it is something that could never be materialized.
By the way, do you see any connection between Fellini's work and, India and the Indian imaginary?
I think Fellini is one of the few filmmakers, whose work, transcended the barriers of language, transcended borders, transcended cultures, and his cinema was so visually powerful that probably like Chaplin, one of the very few filmmakers around who could, still communicate even in the absence of sound. And Fellini to India, there has been a lot of retrospectives of Italian filmmakers, and one of Fellini's most popular films in India, from what I've seen talking to critics and film enthusiasts, is obviously La Strada, and the other being Eight and a Half. But I also feel that a lot of other Fellini films like Roma, Amarcord, Cetricon, we need to have a lot more retrospectives of Fellini in India. I'm sure the audiences would love it. Visconti, has always been a very, very popular filmmaker here. But somewhere I feel that Fellini's cinema is so big, the body of work is so huge that the Indian audiences have still not, fully explored themselves, exposed themselves to the work of Fellini. If you look at his early neorealistic work, I see, a great influence on Indian filmmakers like, Satyajit Ray, with what Fellini was doing with Rossellini. Satyajit Ray was directly inspired by neorealism, and, he came back to India from Europe and he made Patha Panchali. And there were films like, Do Bigha Zameen by Bimal Roy. All these films have very strong neorealistic influences. And as I, have always maintained that Fellini's neorealistic phase is always something that, somewhere gets a little underestimated, because we are so much into, his work 60s onwards that we forget his work as a screenwriter, during the neorealistic phase. Those films like Rome, Open City, Pesa, and later on he made these films like La Strada. That influence will always be there. And something that I would like to touch upon, which very few people know, is that Fellini was deeply influenced by Indian philosophy. In his office, he had, calendar art of, uh, Lord Krishna and Radha. And he also had the photograph of Pondicherry goddess. And he had a very strong, inclination towards Indian philosophy. He had an astropalmist, who, connected him, to a lot of, spiritual aspects of India. And, he always felt a very strong connect for India. But for some reason or the other, he couldn't travel to India. But I remember him telling to an Indian journalist once that probably, in my next incarnation, I would like to be born in India. So that's what, Fellini was all about. He really wanted, to have this strong connect with India. But due to some reason, he was never comfortable leaving Rome. Probably, he was not comfortable with traveling. I've heard that he had some issues, with flying and, taking these long tours. And he wanted to stay in Rome because probably he had so many images in his mind and he didn't want to, fill his mind with more images. As I told you earlier about his Jungian influence, and, he was one person who was actively, noting down his dreams. He was, every time he would wake up, he would try and remember his dreams and he would make those images. And perhaps somewhere at one level or the other, these images made way in his movies.
Thank you very much, Murtaza. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Nico.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and see you soon. See you soon. Maybe in real
Okay.
life.
Definitely on the other side of the lockdown.
Great.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good time.